Hello, everyone. Didn't realize I was going early, so I'm a little bit shaken, but I'll get my bearings here. I want to first acknowledge and thank the organizers of this workshop, or day of conversation, really, for inviting me here to speak to you all about ethics. And I kept saying to people as I came in earlier, and Amy knows this, that I'm like, I'm not sure why I'm here talking about ethics, because it's not really something that I find myself an expert in. But what I want to talk to you today about is how I think about ethics within the classroom, within my own research, which is really archival-based and not within a community-based setting, but also, more importantly, as an educator. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And I have to apologize, I'm not the most confident public speaker, so I'm going to read to you from a paper that I wrote. And then, of course, I'd be happy to clarify or take any questions afterwards. So I have been asked to speak today on the subject of ethics from my perspective as an educator of research ethics in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program here at the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. As I already said, I feel a little apprehensive in addressing such an accomplished community and all the university researchers in this room, but I thank the organizers for asking me to come and share how I teach about ethics and the kinds of approaches we take in our unit in First Nation Studies to train researchers to be competent and ethical, and therefore of real use to their communities. I, of course, want to acknowledge the Musqueam community and their unceded traditional and ancestral territory that I've learned so much from in the past 10 years I've been a faculty member at UBC. Often when the stress of this job takes me to a breaking point, which it does often, I simply grab my coat, leave my desk, and walk over to this little grove of cedar trees behind my office in the Chan Center. Sitting there, I often find calm, and it's a place that my partner, who also works here at UBC in the law program, said he goes to when he wants to think or try to work through a problem or just find some peace here at a very busy university. In fact, we both kind of admitted to each other we might have cried a few times in those trees. And then when we told that story, he was like, you know what, another Indigenous scholar from UVic told me he used to come back here and do the same thing. And so I thought, geez, this poor grove of trees has had to comfort and console Indigenous scholars for a very long time. I just wanted to share that little story because it's one of the ways that I think about a territorial acknowledgement. What does this land give to me as a faculty member, as an Indigenous woman, and how does it comfort me through the work that I try to do here at the university? So just wanted to share that little story. In truth, I've had the privilege of working within a unit at the Critical Indigenous Studies Institute that emphasizes and expects from our students to graduate with an intensive community-based research experience, which we just simply call our practicum. We want them to understand and work within not only the ethical guidelines set out in what we kind of use in our formal process, the TCPS 2 Chapter 9, but also beyond the basic expectations of these formal review processes that we all undergo in various capacities. We expect our students to carry themselves in a good way, with a humble heart, and that the research they produce is not only community-centered, but in the best case scenario is also community-driven when possible. While our research practicum is an undergraduate capstone experience, we hear time and time again about the sophistication of the work produced, and the many years my colleagues, Cheryl Lightfoot, Daniel Justice, Link Kessler, Sarah Hunt, and Glenn Coulthard have taught the practicum, we have witnessed our students move on to tribal leadership roles, become community researchers, take on leadership roles here at UBC, such as Amy Perot, or Cecilia over there. And of course, quite a few have moved on to graduate studies. As a way of introduction of myself, I am an Anishinaabe and Mexican woman whose family comes from north central Mexico and the area around Cass Lake and Leech Lake, Minnesota. My mother's family were undocumented migrants who came to the US to work in the beet fields in the 40s and 50s to make a better life so that I might someday migrate myself across another border to raise my family and be here with you today. My father's family have also been the subject of university research, and in fact, my great-uncle Paul Buffalo's stories and life history are archived at the University of Minnesota Duluth, many of which of his stories have been transcribed and are available for online viewing through the University of Minnesota. That particular project has led me to think in my own research about the ways universities hold on to our life stories, and what are the ethical conversations that we need to have when it comes to these holdings. These sets of questions had led me to undertake a project most recently with the IRSI HDC and the wonderful women and staff there, which is in its very preliminary stages, but is around student engagement with the archive and the ethical questions that must be answered before any engagement takes place. In thinking about what I could possibly offer in the way of a research ethics discussion, I was struck by the fact that this week in my Indigenous Studies classroom, I had the privilege and pride to teach 3 articles from graduate students who are here at UBC on the collaborative projects they have done within community and for their community. One of those articles was a project by FNIS alum and Musqueam scholar, Jordan Wilson, who created for the university a walking tour of many of the house posts you will see as you walk around the campus. And you might see this little book. There's some downstairs. Pick one up. This walking tour guide you can pick up at the Belkin or downstairs, which I just noticed when I was coming in. At the Belkin is also currently showing an exhibit curated by Jordan Wilson about the Salish Weavers Association. I bring up this article and walking tour because I thought it was just an excellent way to frame a conversation on ethics at UBC and the commitments UBC needs to make in its ongoing commitment to Musqueam and to Indigenous studies and Indigenous research. In it, Jordan takes us to the relationship between the university and the Musqueam Nation, one in which the university at first takes on Musqueam house posts to assert a certain way of viewing cultural objects for its own distorted and inaccurate purposes, as Wilson says, depoliticizing them from their original context. Yet by the end of the tour, Jordan brings you to the most recent house post by Brett Sparrow Jr., just right out here. If you look out the window, you'll probably see it, for the 100th anniversary of the university. Wilson asserts the university with this post has now begun to understand the political and legal meaning of these gifts that assert this is still Musqueam land. The historical shifts, of course, are evident in this room today, but one that must be continually attended to, and I think that's one conversation I keep hearing over and over again, that what is it that the university and this office is going to do to recognize legal and political commitments to self-determination in Indigenous communities. That the university will always have cultural belongings or Indigenous presence is one thing. That they understand and recognize the self-determination and legal authority of Indigenous peoples is another. At any rate, I highly encourage you to take a look at the book and do the tour if you have some free time for the rest of the day, which you might because we're kind of ahead of schedule. I could sing the praises of our alumni for the entire 20 minutes I have up here, but that would probably be more than a little self-indulgent. What I would like to do with my time is simply tell the story of how my unit has hoped to frame the subject of research ethics for our students, graduate and undergraduate. While FNIS is an undergraduate program, we do offer one graduate course on Indigenous research methodologies and ethics, which I've had the privilege to teach for the last several years. I think it's a testament to the desire for students in graduate work and other researchers to have this conversation just by the amount of students who want to take that class. I've had to impose an application process because the overwhelming desire to take that course, and we just don't have the capacity to do it. And when I do teach that course, it's interesting to me because I have people from the medical school, I have people from architecture, I have people from journalism, I have from all over the university. And of course, when I teach that Indigenous research methodologies class, I'm like, well, how am I gonna do this? But somehow we figure it out. Many of you are probably well familiar with Indigenous research methodologies, as evidenced by the conversation this afternoon, which operate on a spectrum of community-based participatory research to community-driven and collaborative research projects. Much of the literature on Indigenous research methodologies and ethics works to undo the impacts of colonial assumptions about the value of Indigenous peoples' knowledge and culture, assumptions that led to the pillaging of belongings, bodies, and traditional knowledge primarily for the gain of others. This story is one well documented and one we discussed earlier, and I just wanted to presence Linda T.Y. Smith's work, who reminds us that for many Indigenous communities, research is still a dirty word. Her point is upheld by the history of research ethics in the West, which overall has been a story about war crimes, power, and abuse, and responses to such atrocities. When I teach my research ethics unit in the methodologies course, and I have to give credit here to Link Kessler, who we've talked about many times, whose syllabus I borrowed some of the readings from, we begin with that history. The students read early ethics declarations such as the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, and learn the history of abuse that such documents addressed. We watch President Bill Clinton's apology to the survivors of the Tuskegee syphilis study and discuss how apologies by state agencies, often aimed at marginalized communities, often come too little or too late and ring hollow if not followed up by action and the changes that they are meant to attend to. All of this history shows the students that the world's discussion of basic principles of ethical research were often instigated by the exposure of extreme abuses of power and the dehumanization of research subjects in a research context. Of course, we have, as Indigenous people, a number of stories to tell in this same vein. However, the positive part of this history is that the West, when confronted with its own values and failings, have come together in international and national context to condemn the atrocities committed in the name of research. And yet these conversations are never fully complete as the nature of research changes and proliferates, and those doing the research are no longer just those who have traditionally held power. The world of research ethics, in a sense, is always a step behind, and thus must always be an ongoing consideration and conversation amongst us as researchers and educators. Indeed, the Tri-Council policy statement's updates primarily have been to address the context of Indigenous research in response to the demands of Indigenous communities and researchers for change and redress. In addition to these readings, of course, the students are asked to read university-based research guidelines, take the TCPS training, and more importantly, given the opportunity to read guidelines for ethical research designed by Indigenous communities themselves. In navigating the history of research ethics in the West, the contemporary expectations of their own institution, as well as Indigenous nations' approaches to the subject of ethics review, the students are perhaps awash in conflicting and confusing expectations. As an instructor, it is my job to offer guideposts on how to navigate the expectations of all these principles and to help them understand that as researchers, they must adhere to these principles and be able to articulate potential conflicts between expectations of their organizations, community collaborators, and/or the UBC board. In the end, however, I want them to understand a simple definition that ethics is a comportment, how you carry yourself, and as someone said earlier and again this afternoon, akin to morality. For as educators, we try to instill in our students that the ethics process is more than filling out a form or a conversation that the West has had in order to fix its past mistakes. Ethics from an Indigenous studies perspective is a whole host of practices, values, and commitments driven by community expectations and ways of being. How do we get students then to understand the university ethics approach as a necessary but bureaucratic process that won't capture everything their community partners expect of good and ethical research? In my undergraduate research methodologies course, after we read a number of those ethics documents, I asked my students to write a personal research ethics statement. I asked them to spell out what principles of ethical research they hold as core to who they are as Indigenous or non-Indigenous researchers. I tell them it is not a contract, and more often than not, they might not be able to live up to their own expectations of themselves. None of us can. As each research context is a negotiation of time, points of view, and other factors that change in an instant in the process. I asked them to think about what they might have to compromise on in university research contexts, and more importantly, the things that they won't. It is an exercise in thinking about how they hold themselves accountable, because in the university context, more often than not, they are the ones doing the reporting. For my graduate course, I do something similar, but in relation to the long-form application, which we all love, know and love. They all have to prepare for their research projects. I asked them to take their application and then annotate each box on the form with what they couldn't fit in, what the university wasn't asking of them, but what they were thinking about in the context of Indigenous research methodologies. All of this is to instill in the students that ethical review in the institution is the very least of what is expected of them as researchers in Indigenous contexts. And oftentimes I have students will say, I don't want to learn about the ethics review process because it's a bureaucracy, it's a process, I don't need to know. Why do we have to talk about this? Well, I'm like, well, one, because you have to do it. But two, it's the lowest bar of expectation, so you should be able to do it. Okay. Of course, we know that the community is ultimately the ones to hold researchers accountable, but it is the students' responsibility to know who they are ethically and return to those core principles again and again, and not rely on others to do that work for them, or to think of ethics as a one step in the research process. I hope that as this office develops workshops and conversations about what ethical guidelines it hopes to promote or adhere to, that this conversation can take the time to think beyond the Tri-Council statements on Indigenous research, even though those are super important policies and documents. At the same time, how might IRSI create spaces for communities to have their own conversation on what ethical guidelines or policies they might want to develop if they haven't already? I say give space because in no way do I think the university can or should lead these discussions. As the chair of our internal research review board in FNIS, I see this as our next step internally to articulate in some policy or statement what is our vision of ethical research beyond the TCBS Chapter 9. I know we have ideas that I see my colleagues on the board articulate very well every year as we go through the student files. Our internal report, in fact, came out of the need to provide our students with clearer and more hands-on feedback of their ethics applications and research projects. What this internal board allows us to do in CIS is also provide students with feedback not only on questions of ethics, but also how their research design might actually improve by amplifying community engagement, or in some cases, pulling back on the project deliverables and process so they don't overcommit what they cannot actually accomplish in the time they have in their 4th year. The board itself is made up of faculty in our program, advanced student representatives, a member of the UBC Ethics Office, who we kind of rely on for all the policy stuff, and most importantly, representation from the Musqueam community. Elder Larry Grant and Leona Spera have been really helpful in sitting on the board with us for a number of years. There are very few university committees that I can honestly say I look forward to each year, but this is by far at the top of my list. As a collaborative review process with scholars and community members, the things I may flag as an ethics issue often is bolstered by others on the committee, but equally, if not more often than not, they see the things I have not even thought of, and the conversation is rich. Once we have our discussion of each file, we provide the students with a list of ordinary provisos, the things they need to change on their ethics application to, pass. But more importantly, a list of research design suggestions that to me is the most valuable advice and what constitutes the Indigenous ethics intangibles not captured by formal review. I think this collaborative approach to ethics review by people who do this kind of work has a lot to do with the success of our practicum program and the research partnerships that continue to support it. Finally, the last point I want to make flows from my work with our Faculty Association on Equity and Diversity in my capacity as the Status of Women Chair for the university. I had the privilege of attending a conference last Friday in Ottawa on indigenizing the academy. We haven't figured it out yet. Hosted by the Indigenous staff and faculty of the Canadian Association of University Teachers. What struck me as the main argument in most of the presentations was that to do Indigenous research from an Indigenous methodology and ethical standpoint, one needed an institution to understand that ethical research for Indigenous community members meant that things like relationship building, meaningful consultation processes, accountability, and community-based knowledge dissemination is a labor-intensive process that doesn't fit neatly with the administrative expectations of faculty research timelines for promotion, tenure, or other standard bearers of success. Last week, it broke my heart a little to witness beautiful, strong Indigenous women present one after another, not on their path-breaking and super important work they were doing for their communities, but presenting on the subject of burnout in their first year, trying to juggle the university's expectations of success against what they really cared about, how their community felt about their work, and what they were doing. The community work and service that these women felt not only obligated to do in order to align themselves ethically to collaborative Indigenous research projects often was met with skepticism and resistance when it came time to report on their research activities in yellow reports. In addition, the work they did to give back to their communities in the form of community reports, policy recommendations, and other forms of writing was not counted as real research in their assessment. As part of the ethics conversation I teach to my graduate students, and that we look out for in our undergraduate review board, is that the researchers are also protected and cared for, because good research practices will not come from tired, overworked, and under-acknowledged Indigenous researchers. It is my hope that this office also provides Indigenous researchers with the supports they need to translate their research activities as work, recognized and affirmed by their institutions as much as it is by their communities.